The old Chinese saying goes, 得民心者得天下，失民心者失天下. Those who gain the hearts and minds of people will rule the world, while those who lost the hearts and minds of people will lose control of the world. The famous military strategist Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, not the Art of the Deal, also states, 攻城为下，攻心为上, meaning to physically conquer a city is the lesser strategy, while conquering the hearts and soul of people is the better strategy. Understanding that the U.S. is fighting trade wars all over the place, including bullying its neighbors,
be announcing tariffs on Canada and Mexico,
and alienating its traditional allies,
Canada is going to be our 51st state.
offending literally every country in the world,
EU's been very nasty at it.
and moreover, tearing its own social fabrics apart, casting aside its own citizens, and eroding its own democratic foundational system and governments. China does not have to do anything other than to wait for the U.S. to collapse under its own weight. How do you win a war? Fighting a war is never about just military might or your brute force. It's all about economic power, the will to win by its people. That was true in the past, it is true in the present-day economy, and it will continue to be true in the future. However, this economic power is not measured by one's absolute strength, but by one's ability to outlast the other. Like in the Cold War, the United States did not beat Soviet Union on the battlefield, but simply outlasted that country in a military race, which is essentially an economic race. China may have a weaker economy than the US, but it is used to isolation and destitute. It will not bow down to imperialism or someone who is trying to bully it. To the contrary, the overt external pressure will make China more united, more resilient, and more resourceful. On the other hand, when was the last time the US won a war when its casualty become a little too high, or when its domestic economy is under stress? Case in point, Bush Sr. started war in Iraq and immediately lost the next election to Clinton. The US does not have the resiliency and will not stay on a fixed course, even if that course may benefit the US in the long run. The entire US mentality is built on a short-term reward system. Consequently, in a lose-lose situation, the US cannot outlast China. This has been proven over again and again, first during the Mao's era, and then during the last Trump trade war. China does not have to do anything other than to wait for the US to collapse. The US strategy is full of internal contradictions, and its policies and actions push others closer to China, not away from it. It makes countries who have not previously thought of the US as a potential adversary to now think of US as a potential adversary. Even Canada is now waking up to the realization that it would need to diversify and hedge against the US.
We will never be the 51st state. We will bear any burden and pay any price to protect the sovereignty and independence of our country.
The US strategy is supposed to isolate China, but its behavior will cause China and other countries to forge closer alliance, which will dramatically weaken the effectiveness of the US policy. This is like someone trying to stop his spouse to have an affair with her romantic lover by abusing and demeaning her. What do you expect the spouse to do when she has nowhere to go? The US America First policy overtly ignores the interests of other parties and plays a zero-sum game. It makes other countries realize that there is no need for fairness and compassion and care for common interest. As a result, there will be Canada first, EU first, Russia first, and China first, making the world a much more hostile place for everyone. The US is no longer seen as a beacon of hope in the world, but just another selfish and lawless country who cares no one but itself. Even if the US gained a few benefits for the short run, it has walked back decades of goodwill that the US has built and weakened the US authority on issues of morality, democracy, and human rights. As a result, we're going to see that China would dramatically increase its space programs. It will try to plant their flags on the surface of the moon and even on Mars and proudly claim that if the US can do it, so can they. It is gloves off for them, which is extremely hostile to us and dangerous as such. But seriously, the Chinese are ready and well prepared to fight back this time. China will levy retaliatory tariff on US import and will specifically target products that hurt US farmers and exporters located in American heartland. One strategy China can adopt is that they will aggressively develop its own technology and sell to the rest of the world. In fact, they will be forced by the US to do so. For example, the US put hard restrictions on China on semiconductors and chips. This already forced China to develop its own semiconductor industry and chip R&D and manufacturing capacity. As a result, China used to be many years behind the US, and now they are probably within striking distance from us. The US used to think that China is a few years behind the US in terms of AI technology because of the restrictions on chip sales to China. However, as recent incidents show, that China is equally competitive and maybe even more competitive when it comes to AI models. Whether it is technology embargo or high tariffs, it may stop China for a short period of time, but it won't be effective in the long run. In fact, it may serve as a catalyst for more Chinese innovation, which in turn hurts the US long-term competitiveness. The other strategy China can adopt is for them to focus on developing its own domestic market in terms of consumption and investments. China is already the world's largest economy and has pivoted to be relying on domestic consumption as opposed to relying on export when US tariff may be relevant. When its internal market is as big as that of the US, it will have the same pull at the US in terms of dictating who is a friend and who will be a foe. The US will completely lose its leverage should that happen. What else can China do? The worst it can do is to establish a financial and currency system that is untangled from the US dollars. The reason that the US has been able to borrow a ridiculous amount of national debt and has not suffered any serious consequences so far is because that the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. Because of that, the US can always print more money to pay off its debt when it is due. However, if the US is like another country, Greece for example, whose currency is tied to other currencies it has no control over, then there will be more risks of default and financial disasters. In fact, China has already tried to use its own currency to denominate many transactions. If the US pushes other countries away and towards China and forces those countries to diversify and hedge against the US, including US dollars, it will brew for bigger trouble to the US than ever imaginable. So how is China fighting back the US tariff tactically? The answer is that China is not taking much actions. It symbolically protested and brought suit to the WTO. It raised some tariffs purportedly proportional to that of the US. But truth be told, China is carrying on its own business while laying low, trying not to further provoke Trump and patiently wait for the US to hurt its own interests. For example, they're waiting for the tariffs to hurt the US people with higher prices, higher inflation, higher unemployment rate, shortage of toilet paper, possibly an economic depression, or even heaven forbid, a 1929-style recession. China will suffer during the process, but it will also inflict serious pain to the American people. Do you think that we can win the trade war? How do you even define winning the trade war? How much do we have to pay in the short term, but more importantly in the long term, to win the war? And to what end? Is there a better way to do things? Ask yourself, how much are you personally willing to sacrifice? That would be the ultimate test, isn't it? Thanks for watching.